Hey, Dr. Drew here, and this is just a reminder that the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care or medical evaluation. This is purely for entertainment and education. We hope you learned something, but see your doctor, get proper medical care. Well, one of the great parts about working in recovery is seeing former patients successfully move on. And I've had patients that have come up to me years later and shake my hand and say, you know what, sometimes people are kicked out of treatment. And many of these folks move on to become mental health professionals themselves. And, of course, the field of psychology is vast. The need for competent practitioners is huge. If you're considering this rewarding career, I urge you to consider the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant University. Now, I've known them for a long time at Alliant University. I've spoken at their past events. It was founded in 1969. It's boasts an alumni network of nearly 50,000 people worldwide. And Alliant has fostered many of today's mental health pioneers, authors, and advocates. CSPP at Alliant University hosts both on-ground and online programs in business psychology, marriage and family therapy, clinical counseling. They also offer APA-accredited doctoral programs in clinical psychology that can allow for specialization in child psychology, clinical forensic psychology, and integrated psychology. And the faculty is crazy. It's made up of leaders and historical figures like Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Viktor Frankl, some of the true fathers of modern psychology. For more information, and I worked alongside of these students as well, by the way, in the clinical setting, as well as having lectured at the institution. So for more on the California School of Professional Psychology, CSPP, at Alliant, click the Alliant banner on our website or visit Alliant, ALLIANT.edu, alliant.edu.
Welcome to Weekly Infusion with Dr. Drew Pinsky and Dr. Bruce Heischober. Weekly Infusion addresses medically related topics. It's in the know, entertaining, and everything you want to know about health and medicine. Now may I present to you the very wonderful Dr. Drew and Dr. Bruce.
I am very, very excited today. I want everyone to listen. I shit you not, you will learn a ton today. I guarantee it. Dave McRaney is a student of psychology. He's a journalist. His podcast is You Are Not So Smart. You can get it on iTunes. His book is You Are Not So Smart. He also has You Are Now Less Dumb, his other book. You can follow him at David McRaney, McRaney.com. You can also follow his Twitter at David McRaney. Dave McRaney, welcome to the program. We have a crappy connection. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
There you go. I got you now. Listen, thank you for being here. I found your podcast, and I thought, oh, my God, I've discovered the Holy Grail. I've discovered the answer. I'm always looking for good pods and lectures and stuff. I worked my way through all of iTunes U, and I found my way to your podcast, and I'm sorry to say I devoured it in about 3 weeks. So you need to put new ones up quick. But thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. I've been working so hard on this new project that I've had to step away and kind of. I'm really looking forward to this next batch of podcasts we're about to put out. And
good. No, you may be looking forward to them, but only half as much as I am. So thank you for that.
That's the greatest thing. You're blowing my mind right now. That's so fantastic.
Well, you think about it. I mean, I'm fascinated by the human mind. I'm fascinated by all the different elements, all the different pieces that make up our neurobiology and human psychology, and you explore these phenomenologies bit by bit, and you break them down, and you talk the sources, the people that sort of first either invented these concepts or observed these phenomena.
Yeah, I started the podcast as a way to promote the second book, and I thought, why don't I just interview the people who I'm writing about? And then the more I did that, the more I realized, which is right in the vein of what the whole show is about, that a lot of things that I thought I knew I didn't know, or I didn't know them quite as well. And it's just been amazing to go straight to the source. And we've been, the two ideas that drive You're Not So Smart is you're unaware of how unaware you are, and you're the unreliable narrator in the story of your life. So that was like my thing for so long, was to take these sort of maybe not so, to take these sort of fatalistic ideas and make them optimistic and find sort of this shared humility vibe. But it wasn't until this last year and a half or so that all of a sudden it feels like everybody's head turned this way and said, "Oh, wait, this guy's already talking about all this stuff that's suddenly top of mind for a lot of us." This weird epistemic chaos that we found ourselves in here recently, where we're worried about what is the truth and what is real news and what is how do I talk to people who think differently than me. And it's really neat that I have a bank of stuff you can just plow through, and it's also fun to take that feedback and guide producing new material now.
Now, I'm gonna walk through all the the topics that fascinate me, but first take me back to, so you're training, you're a journalist, right? Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was doing things like covering Hurricane Katrina and cops and courts and stuff like that, but when I was in school, I thought I was going to be a psychologist, I wanted to be a therapist, but I had a lot of luck with the student newspaper, and I got a good scholarship for writing a story about Hurricane Katrina, and I went that route. And when I ended up as an editor, I didn't have an outlet for all that psychology stuff, and I just started a blog. I started it based off of a Darren Brown experiment where he does the person swap. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
No, tell us.
It's one of the great. This is what started everything. I saw a YouTube video in which Darren Brown walks up to people on the street and asks them for directions, and then as they're talking, two people walk between them with a giant painting, and one of the people holding the painting switches places with Darren Brown, and so now there's another person talking to the person that was just talking to Darren Brown, and or there's another person in place of Darren Brown, and the person giving directions never noticed. It never noticed that the person right in front of them just changed places.
This is the same thing as the gorilla walking across the basketball court or whatever that one experiment was, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that was his inspiration, was that those same scientists had done a experiment in which they had a student hand in a paper, and when the person was to give them their credit, they ducked beneath a desk, and when they stood back up to give them the credit, it was a different person, and they just recorded whether or not people noticed. And in the Darren Brown thing, of course, it's edited to seem like everyone is crazy, but in the actual experiment, about 30% of people noticed. But even that was so insane to me that I thought to myself, there's no way, I would totally see this. And I just sort of dived into that wing of psychology that explores self-delusion and bias and judgment and decision-making and this our overconfidence in all of our cognitions. And
yes.
I just started a blog about that, and that blog led to all this.
Yes, we have a deficient instrument. The human brain, as wonderful it's not a perfect instrument, but we feel like ours is perfect. Our perception is ours is giving us an accurate rendition. Now, one of the phenomena, let's get into a little bit here, is people are actually making fun of me. I've been referring to it so much lately, and that is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And I forget why it came up for me, but it had deep meaning. Well, do you remember the time when I started bringing this up? It was about 6 weeks ago. I started talking about it a lot.
Pretty recently.
Yeah, a couple of months ago. And it was something in the news or something somewhere. And, I was like, well, that's Dunning-Kruger. And then I came upon your thing, and you actually talked to Dr. Dunning. And I was sort of blown away. Yeah. And so tell us about what you learned from talking to him.
Well, Dr. Dunning, first of all, that was one of those amazing moments where I was like, I just cold emailed him and said, "Would you like to be on the show?" He's like, "Okay, and let's talk tomorrow." So we did. And so he studies incompetence. He studies, but not incompetence itself. He studies I guess he probably would bristle at that. He studies how difficult it is for us to estimate how good or how bad we are at a certain task or how much skill we have related to a certain type of problem solving or goal oriented behavior. So he was inspired by a news story in which someone tried to rob a bank, and when they captured the bank robber, he said, "But I wore the juice, and he had squirted lemon juice all over his face, and he thought that would make it so cameras couldn't see him. Right. He had read that somewhere, and maybe it was based off of making your own invisible ink. But whatever it was, Dunning thought, now this is an extreme case of something that we all do, which is we think we know what we're doing when we don't know what we're doing, but we proceed that anyway. So they did a series of studies in which they zeroed in on our tendency to I think we've all experienced this. It's so easy to go from novice to amateur at anything, like learning how to play guitar or any task where there is a level of mastery that we can all acknowledge is that person is an incredible talent. It's so easy to go from novice to amateur that we assume it takes the same amount of time to go from amateur to master. But when you're at the amateur level, you greatly overestimate your skill and your ability. And
this is why I will tell you, this is why all my peers, my physician peers, have begun posting in their office a sign that says, please do not confuse your Google search with my medical training. Not kidding.
So totally.
Yeah.
Totally. WebMD is like, and that manifests in everything, where people have a far less regard for expertise, because now you can go on the internet and do. People say I did a lot of research, assuming that, but they don't understand what real research is like, right, and what it's like to spend 25 years trying to understand a topic.
It's funny. I'm hearkening back to some advice I gave my kids, and now I'm so glad I gave them. I said, listen, develop an expertise in something so you know what that is. I don't care what you're an expert in, but I want you to be an expert, because just knowing what the difference is between knowing something and being an expert, that's an important thing for someone to understand.
Truly, and I've reminded anyone who's ever played a role-playing video game can relate to the leveling up process, where it takes twice as long to go from 1 to from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4. And so, to get up to the highest levels, you may have to spend as much time as it took for you to get to level 25 as it does to get to level 26. And that's just a counterintuitive thing for most of us, especially we live in a culture that really lauds a certain level of passes over celebrity to people who have a lot of talent or who can perform really well. Dunning said, somehow just by a twist of fate, it was named after him and his colleagues. But he had always wanted to call it the American Idol effect, because he said that every time you watch American Idol, even though the show is produced to give you certain examples of people who think they're better than they really are, it is an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where someone who in their town or in their circle of friends, they're an amazing talent, and they are probably the best singer in their social group. But then they get on stage in front of judges who have seen the really extreme talent, and they just aren't up there. But they don't know that personally, and so they assume, based off of their own estimation of their own ability, that they're way better at what they're doing than they really are.
It seems to me there are two features of the American Idol effect, let's say. Well, one is the sort of knowledge from ignorance, right? They just don't know, they don't have it, they don't know it. But the other is the blind spot in self-assessment, right? Are they two different elements?
No, you're hitting right on it. Dunning says that it's really all about self-assessment, that we are not. That is one of the things that we are the poorest at. We're unaware of how unaware we are at all levels. So, but the other side of that coin is that we are set up with this positivity bias, where everyone thinks they're better looking than they are. Everyone thinks they're a better driver than they are. Everyone thinks whatever field you're in the top, at least the top 50% of that field. And so, since we are all tilted in favor of seeing ourselves in a better light than we truly are in, you add that to the fact that we aren't very good at self-assessment, and there's really probably no way that you know how good you are at anything, even if you're really good at it. Dunning-Kruger effect is true for both sides of that spectrum, which is something that gets left out a lot, that geniuses who don't know that they're geniuses are also under the influence of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And if they live in a world of people who aren't geniuses, they never really get a chance to test themselves in a way that would show them that they are above average. So they assume that whatever they do that's easy for them is easy for everyone.
Well, I'm guilty of this, and I think it hooks into self-esteem somehow. You should do a thing on self-esteem, because that's a hot topic too. But I'm going to do that very soon with Will Storr. He's a great author. Right. He's written a good book about that. Great, because the self-esteem movement is sort of a failure, and I have low self-esteem. There's also data that shows you can't really change self-esteem after age 5. But my thing is, I'm fine. I have low self-esteem. It makes me work harder, but it also makes me not assess myself well. My feeling is, well, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So what's the big deal? You know what I mean? If I listen to all of you are not so smart, well, anybody would do that. And anybody would get out of it what I would do because I do it. So who wouldn't?
Right.
Right.
You know what's weird about? Yeah. You know what's crazy about self-esteem? Actually, this is in my new book, and I wrote just a little bit about it. Is that this is psychology suffers, and you've probably heard the episode I did about weirds, the effect that a lot of psychology. Yeah, okay. So
let's define it. It's a Western, educated, industrial. What? What's R?
Democratic and rich.
Rich democratic. Yeah.
So, relative to the rest of the world. So the psychology going back to Piaget and to the Milgram experiments and everything that you've ever.
You and I know what that is. I'm going to stop. And Piaget was a famous Swiss developmental psychologist. He really developed some of the stages of cognitive development, one way or another conceived. And then Milgram experiment is a famous experiment where they put these people in a room and they had them electrocute a person in the other room. They thought that's what they were doing. And they would actually go, because there was a guy in a white coat standing by them telling them to proceed, they would actually go until they killed the person. That's essentially the Milgram experiment. So, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
So everything that you learned in your Psych 101 class and everything you've ever seen on like a BBC documentary or on the Discovery Channel or whatever, like everything that you've ever learned about psychology really up until 2011 was based off of research with the easiest pool of subjects to put into experiment, which was college students.
Undergraduates,
at universities, usually in the United States, because psychology is far more popular in the United States than any other country. So as researchers have told me that it's almost as if it would be like if biology was 100% based just off of one particular species of cave spider.
Right.
So we have this great bevy of information about one type of human mind, and it's just because Westerners, especially Americans, are very culture blind. They don't really they think that the way we are is the way everyone is, and we just assume that there was a universal human mind. And psychology that has broken out and tried to take its research and apply it to multiple cultures has found that there's a lot of variance, even on effects that are fundamental. And self-esteem is one of these things where if you go to, they did a cross-cultural research between American and Canadian universities and Japanese universities, and they found they were trying to see what is the best approach to get a classroom to. The same thing was repeated in every classroom. So the classroom would take this test, and then at the midpoint, they would trick everyone into thinking that the computers had broken down and they had to be fixed. And in the downtime, they told them they could then take this spare extra time to keep studying and to go through the practice exams and spend some more time studying. And at that point, they gave them feedback. They told them how well they had done up until that point. And so they wanted to see if you found out you were doing poorly, would you spend the extra time trying to catch up? And if you found out you're doing really well, would you spend that extra time to get more ahead, or would you be more laid back? And they found that for Westerners, if they found out they were ahead, they would work harder. If they found out they were behind, they wouldn't put in any more effort. They found out for people who lived in Japan, if they found out that they were really far ahead, they would actually stop putting in effort and try to ease up so they would meet up with the group. And if they were really far behind, they'd put in extra effort to try to match. So the question then is, if you were going to design a program for a classroom and you're trying to decide, do I give people gold stars and extra merit for doing really well, or do I berate them and say you need to catch up when they're doing poorly? If I had to choose one or the other, the correct solution is different depending on the type of brain that you're dealing with. There's not a universal answer to that. You have to actually really acknowledge the culture that you're dealing with. And psychology up until 2011 would have looked for the answer instead of the answer dependent upon the culture. And the way that relates to self-esteem is that in the West, if you have high self-esteem, it correlates with low blood pressure. You're less likely to get divorced. You're more likely to just be healthy in general, and all sorts of these other qualities that correlate with high self-esteem. All those qualities correlate in the negative in Eastern cultures, if you have high self-esteem. So a person with high self-esteem in Japan is actually more likely to have high blood pressure. They're more likely to be overall a sadder person and be a lot more prone to depression. So much so, the self-esteem doesn't even exist in that cultural framework. They have a borrowed American word, seferostimu, because it just simply there was no they couldn't even make sense of it in the schema that they used to understand the world.
They are so I forget the word that the psychologists use, but sort of communal. That if you were thinking a lot about yourself, you would be a threat to that system and probably shamed, ostracized.
Yeah. The current view in that is that we have a Westerners have a very, if you think of us almost like a cell membrane, like Westerners have a very impermeable membrane when it comes to our social lives.
Yeah.
Like we will touch it, we'll butt up against each other, but we won't go any further. Whereas people from Japan, in the cultures we've studied in Japan and other Eastern cultures, there's much more likely that the membrane is permeable, and people have a very interconnected life. That's just something that the way we make sense of the world doesn't match up to the way people whose brains have been shaped by growing up in that culture wouldn't. It's so deep that the optical illusions that work on Westerners sometimes don't work on people in other cultures, and vice versa. It's really a fascinating. It's almost as if psychology hit reboot, and we can actually start anew. It's almost like the entire field is cranking up and starting from step one again, which I think is exciting.
That is interesting. Yeah, I agree. Well, let's talk about some of the stuff you were alluding to in your opening comments in the world such as it is, when people seem unable to have find common grounds, have civil discourse, influence one another's opinions. And of course, the backfire effect is the ultimate sort of problem. But let's talk about sort of, I guess the big topic would be what, knowledge from ignorance?
Yeah, I think what happened here is we're all stuffed in each other's pockets now, and thanks to social media, thanks to smartphones, thanks to a new literacy for these devices and the worlds to which they connect and to the communities that we have now been thrown into. I think that it's just we're much more likely to confront people who believe differently than we do now, and not in a glancing way where we are like, yeah, that guy's crazy, or that person thinks, believes this, and that's just not me. We've all had that experience on Facebook where we realize, oh no, my friend is, that one of those kind of people.
Is that guy?
Right.
Stop him.
You might have lived your whole life never getting into an argument with that person or with a family member,
or even knowing that they harbor these feelings or thoughts.
Right. And so the thing that was common to academia, common to scientific journals, or common to philosophy or whatever, people who are used to having a good faith argument or having a debate, or having an all-out dispute or whatever, these have now become part of our daily lives for everyone, for the layperson.
In science, though, the whole discipline is about knocking down our theories, dismantling the theories that are out there to try to, come up with a better one. I mean, that's just the discipline of science is about attacking each other's positions. And we expect that's the work of science. But somehow to do that now to a non-scientist is offensive. It's problematic. It's an assault.
Yeah, it is. It's for people who think in that way already, they have to stop for a second and realize they had to be trained to think that way. And that is not the default setting of the human mind, and that's not the default way that we have created our civilizations. This is not how we had to invent science. It's a tool. And before we had it, we thought a lot of really weird stuff. And we did that. Even as scientists, for the way science updates itself through building pretty robust models that over time build up anomalies to the point that the model has to be replaced to make sense of the anomalies, that is, even science had to learn how to do that. And scientists resist it, even though that's built into the framework. But the average person the average brain doesn't do that, for good reason, because our models, if you think of a framework to understand the world like, the theory of gravity or whatever, but we have the same sort of system, schemas, worldviews, models, whatever word you want to use to describe it. The human brain creates a model of reality to make sense of the world around it. And there was V.S. Ramachandran told me to think of it like a general inside a bunker.
He's a very, very famous neurologist. Think of it like what? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, he's an amazing neuroscientist. I should introduce these people better.
Yeah.
So he's a neuroscientist who studies like phantom limbs and things like that. Yeah. He became famous for studying that. And he told me to remember the brain generates a model of reality that it then interacts with, and it's trapped in the skull. It can't actually interact with the outside world, so it has to interact with the outside world through messengers. He likes to think of it like a general inside a bunker. The general standing at one of those war tables, like in Game of Thrones, and the advisors come in the room and say, this has happened, and so then they move the pieces on the table. So the general can only deal with that model, and the model updates based off of what the general is being told from the messengers. And if there is something wrong with the model, there's something inaccurate, there's no way to tell. You have to presume that it would be catastrophic to the organism to just simply do away with the model and start over again. So you have to work with what you have, and so we're very protective of keeping the schema alive. Even when we think that when we think our models might be incorrect, the knee-jerk reaction is to try to bring the anomaly in line with the model, not to bring the model in line with the anomaly. And that is important because if we did it the other way around, we'd just change our minds on a whim, and we'd never be able to survive in a changing environment. So when you deal with people, that's why they're not eager to admit wrongness, especially when it's a core belief that is integral to their self or to their identity, which is something we mentioned on the backfire effect episodes, that researchers who put people in MRIs and told them things like, did you know that you can see the Great Wall of China from space, or something like that. People that were easily updated their models when it was something trivial, but when they had them think about things like gun control or abortion or any politically charged issue, they found that people responded in a way that was almost identical to what would happen if you were being attacked by a bear. Like if you're being chased down an alleyway, or somebody's trying to stab you or something. The brain responded as if
their survival was threatened.
Yeah, the brain was, and I was told by the neuroscientists who did this research that the brain, as far as they know, and this is very cutting edge research. This is the first study of its kind, so there's a lot more work to be done, of course. But they said it looked to them as if people were reacting. It was as if threats to the psychological self are treated just like threats to the bodily self, like flesh and blood. Right. And
which
so
makes
the brain
sense.
Is eager to protect itself.
Which makes sense, because the self is really contained in the body, and they're all sort of the same thing that's being protected, right?
Right. And I think that we want to, I like look at that and go, I feel like, what's the magic here? What's the calculus that's taking place in this person's brain? But it's simpler than that. It's the brain, just its number one job is to protect the self. And that the self includes these schemas, that we may not even be aware of these things. In fact, we're most likely not aware of them at all.
Yeah, I was thinking about how, based on that, we'll talk about what the backfire effect is specifically in a minute, but based on that particular podcast, again, of course, the You Are Not So Smart podcast, that particular one, which was on the backfire effect, I found myself thinking, how would I argue with a flat earth theorist? Right? And I thought, you know what I would do? I would go, I bet there's a lot. Why are you guys looking at me?
Because, Drew, you need to realize that you are an exceptionally smart man, and your time is way more valuable than even trying to argue with that person. In Dave McRaney's podcast, he does say the outliers just don't waste your time. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, someone who's that far down that they're willing to argue with an accomplished doctor.
Strangely, that's where I can't stand it. I have to talk to them. That's my own personal psychology. And so I was, but it was an interesting thought experiment though, because I thought, if I were to argue with them, thinking about the fact that they would have to change their worldview if they were to agree with me, I'd want them to understand how my worldview would have to change if I were to agree with them. And I would say things like, well, you know that iPhone you hold in your hand? That wouldn't work anymore. And all I understand about biology and medicine and the first and second law of thermodynamics, in fact, mathematics wouldn't even work if your theory was correct. So I'd have to adjust all of that to make the Earth flat. You can understand that'd be tough for me, right? That's sort of how I was thinking I would argue it.
There's no pictures of round Earth.
Yeah, right.
There's not.
And unfortunately,
all composites.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, would you think that would work?
No,
not
at all.
All right.
I spent the last 2 years working on a book about how to change people's minds, or how minds change, how to change people's minds, how mind change works, how social change works, how people update their priors, and all that stuff. And I actually went to a conference of flat earthers and anti-vaxxers and stuff, and went around arguing with them just to see what it felt like.
Yeah.
And I when I came back from the anti-vaxxer conference, Andrew Wakefield was there, by the way, the famous anti-vaxxer who started the whole thing with his erroneous research. I came back and I talked to Dr. Paul Offit, who your listeners may know is just the world's. He's one of the greatest researchers in vaccination and childhood diseases, and he was telling me that for years they had tried this. What everyone tries. Everyone's knee-jerk reaction when they deal with someone who doesn't believe, who either they think believes is wrong, or they think, or simply just believes differently than them, and they must persuade them otherwise. The knee-jerk reaction is always to try to load facts up on them, to dump a dump truck full of facts in their lap, and have them just go, oh no, there's so many facts here. What am I going to do? I have to change my mind. And if we're online, we go to Google and we go, here's a link, here's a link, here's a link, here's a link, and we just think that the things that convinced us will convince them. Even though if they did the same thing to us, that would never work. They could put as many links as they want into our stream, and we'd be like, whatever. And he calls this, and this is a term of art called the information deficit hypothesis, which is the idea that people who are wrong are just wrong because they don't have all the facts. If you gave them all the facts, they would naturally change their minds. And this is a very old idea. The 19th century philosophers thought that public education would eliminate all superstitions. Benjamin Franklin thought that public libraries would make the common man as educated as the aristocracy and empower democracy. Timothy Leary thought that the computer would give, in his own words, power to the pupil instead of power to the people. It would by being able to choose what goes into your mind, that people would get past the information gatekeepers. We all become these godlike intellects. And in the 70s, psychologists, they blamed polarization, gridlock in American politics, on the fact that issues have become so complex that the average person couldn't educate themselves. And there's all this. There's a whole lot of people from the academy, I guess you'd say, who just thought that the only thing wrong with the world is that people watch too much TV and read too many magazines, and they would all come around with the way we see things. And so the strategy of putting facts in front of people and expecting them just to work magic has never worked, and it never will work on a one-on-one basis. It will work in group deliberation, and we could talk about that. That's a different framework for making sense of the world. But one-on-one, it doesn't work as well as a variety of other methods, motivational interviewing, CBT, active processing, the elaboration, likelihood model. There's a lot of stuff to pull apart there. But the reason it doesn't work is because the individual reasoner who's reasoning along uses a model to make sense of the world through inference and context, to predict the future, to judge how to behave, and so on. And you have to behave in a way that you've behaved in the past, and the world never changes. The facts of the matter never change. Only your interpretation do. So, Peter Ditto told me that we all prefer an incorrect model over an incomplete model. And when you dump a lot of facts into someone's lap, you're basically asking them to knock the leg out of the table of their model of reality,
right,
and wholesale replace it, like at once. Just copy paste all this information into your brain, and we just will physically resist that. and we can talk about the backfire effect if you like, because that's what this leads to. The backfire effect is a very common phenomenon that takes place when it was first researched with people who believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but that it then went on to people who were anti-vaccination. And what they would do is they'd bring people into the lab, and they would show them pictures of children who have suffering from preventable diseases. They would give them messages. Most of these these are all parents who had children who were under the age of 18 who had refused to vaccinate, and who most of them believed that vaccines were caused autism. And so they would give them the information that vaccines don't cause autism. They would show them pictures of children who had suffered. They would give them these accounts from the CDC of what it's like for a child to suffer from like a 102-degree fever for several days.
Or measles, or measles encephalopathy, or encephalitis. I mean, I've seen horrible things. If you don't see that, right, how do you know?
Right. So they dumped all this information onto these people, and this was in a controlled environment where they could study it and quantify it. And what they found was that the end result was that even when the person said, okay, you've convinced me that vaccines don't cause autism, even in that case, their likelihood of vaccination actually plummets after receiving all this information. So much so that the control, who didn't receive any of this information, was more likely to vaccinate than the person who had been meticulously set aside and gone through this gauntlet in which they had been force educated to see the truth of the matter. So the facts backfire in cases like that because people.
So you may persuade may persuade them for that very narrow case, but everything else they double down.
Exactly, and the speculation behind why this happens is that it's something that I'm calling in the book belief whack-a-mole, because what you do is you're not addressing the core belief. You're only addressing the justifications for the belief. The core belief is something along the lines of I don't want to cede my agency as a parent over to this, foreign entity, to this entity, or I don't like the idea of something foreign going into the body of my child. It's a very primal and very root core belief that we're talking about.
It's a primitive belief. It's a very primitive. I know what's best for my child, or these proteins are going to damage my child. How dare they?
Right, and it's a very difficult thing no layperson is going to understand how vaccines truly work, and just the idea that you're putting a chemical in the body of, and you have all these ideas of what scientists are, what doctors are. You have this scary. It's scary, and it's understandable. And I think we should be empathetic toward where that comes from. That's a core belief. So the justification is vaccines cause autism or whatever. That is irrelevant. It doesn't have anything to do with the core belief. You can think of it almost like a corona, as a shell around the core belief. So when you attack the justification, the response from the organism is to produce another justification in its place. Right. And as you keep attacking, what you're doing is you're creating more and more justifications. And so you walk away from the person having given them even more ways to defend their core belief than before you met. And that's what generates the backfire effect. You at the biological level, you've just created more neural pathways and more you've created a denser associative architecture related to that idea. So there are other ways of going about it that will not do that.
How?
Okay. So this is a book-length answer, but I can tell you all sorts of stuff.
This is in your book that's going to come out, right?
Yeah, we're just in second draft right now.
What's it called?
It'll be done.
What's going to be called?
Tentative title is just How Minds Change, but they might come up with something more clever than that before we get finished with this.
You are not so smart, but other people are worse.
I really wanted to write a book about how I was fascinated how same-sex marriage in the United States, the public sentiment was strongly against, and then within 10 years it was strongly for. And it felt like there was no one was providing a good answer as to how that can happen, how so many people can change their attitudes so quickly.
Yeah.
So in pursuit of the answer of that question, I wrote a book about how minds change at the individual level, group level, and then social level.
No, I can't wait. I cannot wait.
It's been quite a journey, because I spent time with Westboro Baptist Church, spent time with former cult members, I've been all over the world with this thing. It's been a really fun project, and scary at times. And I'd never expected Alex Jones and the reptilians to go mainstream. So when I spent time with the people who had left that world, I was like, oh, this is going to really blow people's minds. But now everybody knows who Alex Jones is. So yeah, to change. What's the best way to change a person's mind? I talk a lot about something called deep canvassing in the book. Deep canvassing is a method that was developed by the Leadership Lab. They're a group of activists in California who go door to door, and they knock on the door of people who believe a certain way, and they their task is to try to convince them to change their minds in less than half an hour. And they've been studied quite a bit by political scientists and psychologists at this point. They have about a 10 to 15% success rate, which is some listeners might think that that's low, but when it comes to changing people's mind and persuasion, that is insanely high. Anything above 1% blows anything out of the water. So you have to acknowledge that for really, really deeply held beliefs, your success rate in one conversation is going to be around 10 to 15% with the best methods available. Multiple conversations, that's going to go up. So I'll tell you about two different things. One is something called the effective tipping point, which is, I think, important for everybody to understand, and the other is this deep canvassing method. The deep canvassing method, very quickly, the way it works is this is applicable tomorrow, the next conversation, next argument you have. The first thing you do is you introduce yourself and why you're there, and you want to assure the other person that you're only interested in getting their take on things, getting their opinion, understanding where they're coming from. You're not there to change their mind explicitly. You are just hoping to understand what the foundation of their belief. And then on the issue in particular, if you want to get really serious, you don't actually have to do this step, but you could do it in some other way. They ask for quantification purposes on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you believe in this topic? So let's say we were talking about vaccines, since we're already talking about that. If I was to say vaccines cause autism, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly do you believe that? And whatever the person says, you just accept it because you don't want to start the argument. You don't want to engage in this belief whack-a-mole. Instead, what you say is, and you can change the phrasing of this up any way you want, but this will work tomorrow on Facebook. You say, why is that number right for you? And this is a really, for most of us, this is a question that we think we've asked ourselves and we've answered, but we haven't. And because when you actually watch a person go through this, I ask you, why does that feel like the right number for you? And you have to start actually engaging in active processing to generate a justification for why you just gut reacted to the question I gave you. People often find they don't have a great justification, but that's not where you stop. The next thing they do is they actually provide, in the deep canvassing method, they provide the counter argument. So they want to evoke the person's actual hidden beliefs, and what they want the person to do is go from whatever number they were at to the number in a more extreme direction. And when they go to the more extreme direction, they say, why did you move more in the extreme direction? Why did you think that? And people realize very quickly they start to experience cognitive dissonance at that point because it doesn't really make sense why they don't think of themselves as being an extreme person, and the fact that they move to the extreme so quickly evokes cognitive dissonance. And then at that point, you can begin a conversation where you try to discover, where did that person's belief come from? So in the case of vaccines, you would ask, where did you first hear about vaccines? How much do you know about them? What information do you have about them? What sources have you drawn from? What experience do you have with it? The idea is that you want the person to, like the general in that war room, to suddenly realize, oh wait, I don't really know a lot about this, or my information is all received, or it's based off of purely emotional quality. So the point of the deep canvassing technique is to allow the person to change their own mind, allow the person to privately and in a way that saves face realize the lack of expertise or the how they haven't actually gone through the process of deeply contemplating the issues, so that they can then feel a motivation to update their priors.
Well, it's interesting to me that that's sort of how psychotherapy works, right? It's reflecting back to the person whatever their feeling states are, and just making them look at them, and magically they start shifting.
It's extremely close to
CBT,
the Rogerian technique. Yeah, CBT, Rogerian techniques. It's also very similar to motivational interviewing.
Yep.
The motivational interviewing, for anyone who's never heard of it, it was, and I'm sure this is something that you're very familiar with, because it's used often when treating alcoholism and other conditions.
And if you've ever heard Dr. Miller, I think that's his name, speak, who really developed this, he was trying to figure out why it was that the therapist themselves was the most predictive element in success in treatment. And he came out with this motivational thing that he didn't expect to develop. I've heard him speak a few times. You interview him. He's a very fascinating interview, very smart guy.
That's right. I'll take a note. That's a good. I would love to talk to him. It's wild to think that this motivational interviewing can be. We can do this with each other, talking about the healthcare bill if you want to. Yeah. This is something that we can talk. We can talk about any issue using this framework, and the way this framework works. Is most people in motivational interviewing, they acknowledge that most people know there's no need to point out that a person has a problem or they need to quit smoking or whatever. When you tell people what they should think, they engage in what they call a righting reflex. When you're engaging in a righting reflex, and it causes the other person to take a defensive position, even if they would otherwise agree with you. So what you don't do is offer advice or toss out facts. What you need to do is have the person speak out loud how they feel, because they're more likely to believe what they say. They're more likely to believe what they hear themselves say than what you're barking at them.
I've been complaining a lot lately that our science training is so inadequate in this country, and I'm realizing as I talk to you the reason why is I've learned I was a biologist by training, that things are so infinitely complex that to have a position, forget it. All you have is the evidence, and you can then try to sort of develop a position from the evidence, but be prepared to shift all the time. And particularly when it comes to things like government or social functioning or things you can't even collect objective data on, I don't have an opinion. It's too complicated. And it's so funny to me that people have these strong opinions about things that can't be substantiated. It's interesting.
It is, and that it is so important. You've hit on something that I totally agree with, which is that understanding how scientists think and how science works as an institution and as a tool is more important than any particular fact or trivia that comes out of science. Yeah. Because as a way of thinking, it just allows you to be wrong and to enjoy being wrong.
Well, not only that, I'm thinking about my friend Rob Schneider, who's an anti-vaxxer, and piles on all this data. And the arguments these anti-vaxxers are really interesting. They're way outlying, and they miss some important things. And I look at them as, interesting. I'm glad they're thinking about these things. I don't go, that's the truth. I go. I'm glad they're challenging the currently available wisdom, and let's see if they have something in here that's of reasonable argument. Of course, it's way outlying takes, but that becomes the truth for people that don't understand science as a process.
Yes, and we have. As individual reasoners, we have a vested interest, and they call it epistemic vigilance in the literature. We want to protect the integrity, the coherence of our schema, and which means when we think we might be wrong, we start to behave in a way that is more. We're biased in the direction of our existing model than we are in the direction of whatever it would take to update it. And if you accept that we're weighted in that way, there's people who are very educated or who are doctors or scientists or who are fans of that world and spend a lot of time reading about it and listening to people who talk about it. They want to believe that everybody's a Bayesian, as they say. They just simply look at what is the likelihood that this is true, and they update the statistical model whether or not this is evidence that I might be wrong, so I must update the statistical the percentage chance that this is true versus this is true. But we don't think that. If we have the time, I'd like to talk about that for a second.
Bayes model thinking, Bayesian thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so there's this really great study by a political scientist named David Redlosk, who he set up an environment in which people spent. They looked at an incredible amount of data to choose a political candidate. It was a mock presidential primary, and some people looked at more than 350 pieces of individual data to choose the candidate that most aligned with their values. And then, in the next stage of the experiment, people would sit and, as if they were in a control environment where they would receive information as if they were in the real world from blogs and from television shows and news reports about the campaign as it moved forward. Now, the people didn't know that they had been divided into categories. And each category received a different mix of disconfirming evidence. So they would learn certain things about their candidate that would indicate to them that the person did not align with their values, that it was, as they'd say, it was counter-attitudinal information. In other words, they would learn that they might be wrong. So for one group, it was 20%, and then 40%, and then all the way up to 80%. In other words, for people who got 80% disconfirmatory information, 8 out of 10 of the news reports they were receiving on a daily basis painted their candidate in a bad light based on their values. And so they tracked these people, and they wanted to see what would happen. Would these people give up their candidate, or would they submit? Would the backfire effect prevent them from seeing the truth? And what they found was that at 20% and at 20 and 30%, people at the end of the campaign, it was a mock campaign that ran for a mock 6 weeks. At 20 and 30%, people ended up liking their candidate even more than the people who received no negative information at all. So classic backfire effect. They were hearing all these bad things about their candidate, and they ended up liking that candidate even more than if they had never heard anything bad. But above 30%, as you can see charted on a graph, it starts to arc downward, upside-down hockey stick. And at 80%, people very quickly go, oh, okay, I made a bad choice. And so he calls this the effective tipping point. He and his colleagues call it that, where there is a point at which when the brain receives enough counter-attitudinal information, it will switch from conservation mode to update mode. It's almost like the old floppy disks where you can flip them to read and write on the back using the tab.
But that kind of goes against the information overload, piling on data to the, so let's say, the anti-vaxxers. Is there a tipping point for them, or is that a different kind of process?
I'm glad you said that because we're coming up on a big caveat. So the way he said it, at 15% we experience doubt, but since we're engaging in the backfire effect, we double down. So it takes another 15% to really get to that point where you go, okay, I'm going to start updating my priors. So it seems like a magical number. All we have to do is give people get people to get to see a third, on a daily basis, a third of the information coming in tells them that the world's not the way they thought it was, and they'll change their model. The problem is that we engage in what's called active information avoidance and a lot of other stuff. For one thing, we're very tribal and very partisan, so we're going to live in a filter bubble of sorts that's going to have a lot of reinforcement for our current beliefs. We're in control of what goes into our minds. So we're going to try to stick with information sources that play nice with our preconceived notions. We're also going to engage in all manner of active information avoidance, the kind of thing you do when you get a letter in the mail that has a bill in it, but you don't open it because you don't want to see what it says. So because of that, like for instance with Donald Trump, 91% of the information on a daily basis coming in from the television media was negative, but people are able to
screen it out.
Engage it. Yeah, they're able to screen it out, so they don't reach the 30%. Since we are so protective of our model, we will actively avoid information that we know might be put it at risk. So we actually avoid that 30%. That's why. So there are ways that we can get people to that effective tipping point, and it's good to know that it's there. But you can see that the challenge is not just merely getting people to acknowledge that their models are incorrect. It's getting them to helping them use the control they have of the information going in their mind, as we sort of talked about that earlier, in a way that allows them to benefit from being wrong.
Is there anything? We're running low on time. I feel like I'm going to bring you back to a second episode, but is there anything in the research you did on persuasion that really blew your mind?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've tried to tell this to so many people because it blew my mind so hard. I think there are two experiments, but we don't have much time. The one is that I think that everybody would relate to is the warehouse fire experiment. It was done in the 1990s, and researchers divided people into two groups, and they told them they put them in a situation where it was as if they were getting reports across a police scanner about a warehouse fire that was filled up with material. Some groups were told that the warehouse contained cans of paint, and another group was not told that information, but they were told everything else identically the same. And then at the end of all this, they asked people, why do you think there was so much black smoke in the warehouse fire? And people who had not been told about the cans of paint, they came up with a lot of explanations, but they never mentioned paint cans because that's kind of a weird thing to just come up with on your without unprompted. But the people who were told that there were paint cans in the fire always mentioned the paint cans. So there's a twist in this research. When they did a repeat of this research, they told the people that there were paint cans in the warehouse. At some point, that they told them, no, actually it turns out that was a mistake. There were no paint cans. And so at the end of that run of the research, you have two groups of people who both have the same amount of information. They both know that there were no paint cans in the warehouse, and they know all the other information is the same. But one had been told previously that there were paint cans and then corrected. When you ask those people, you get the same result. The people who know there were no paint cans still say that paint cans were what caused the fire.
It's sort of a weird priming effect or something, right?
Well, this is what's weird. This is one of the weirdest things about So the researchers who did this, who were explaining it to me, said, and this is a quote that I've just been walking around with it for weeks now, or for months now. People prefer an incorrect model over an incomplete model. So because when they did a third run of this research, and they did everything like I just told you, except after correcting the misinformation, they also told them, turns out there weren't paint cans, but there were oily rags. People didn't mention the paint cans ever again. They now mention the oily rags. So when you are trying to correct people's misinformation and you take away something that would be considered a load-bearing wall in how they make sense of a certain, whatever it is you're talking about, and you don't put something in there to replace it, they have no choice. They have no choice but to go back to the incorrect model because the brain won't allow them to just throw up their hands and say, I don't know.
It goes
they
back
have to use something.
It goes back, was it Plato or Aristotle? Man has a desire to know, period. Our brain is constantly needing to understand, and even if it doesn't understand, if it doesn't have adequate information, it will build a model to seem as though it understands.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if your mission is to go around correcting people's misinformation by just taking it away from them, you're not going to accomplish anything. We have no control over our predilection to resist that. You have to go the next step and somehow give them something to rebuild that gap that you're leaving.
I can see how that would blow your mind if you live in the pure world of cognition, but the world I have to mess around in therapeutic context is subliminal motivations that are broken, and then emotional states that people are disconnected from. So I'm very used to people having these dark forces at work that they're not aware of, but I can see so vividly. And it makes sense to me that the cognitive system would have equally sort of, imperfect kinds of. It's not a perfect instrument, our central nervous system. It just isn't. And are you going to, before that you go, are you going to get into emotions at all? Have you seen Lisa Feldman Barrett's stuff and how emotions are created?
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I have not dived in. I explored emotions through a different route, but yes, I'm all up in that.
Okay, I hope you do some pods on that because your pods are so clear. They really sort of. I can tell you spend a lot of time thinking and structuring and laying them out, and so it makes it for the listener. You sort of easy to assimilate the information. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, please, any suggestions, your listeners and you personally that you have for, I think a lot of people assume that, a lot of people assume that I just know. I mean, I'm just I don't know what I don't know. So please send me suggestions or a book that changed your way of looking at the world, or an expert you think has got something that hasn't gotten enough exposure. I'm eager to bring those people to a platform where a lot of people will hear about them.
Okay, David, go to davidmcraney.com, McRaney, and the podcast is You Are Not So Smart. If you don't mind, I'm going to bring you back at some point. I've got a million other things I got to talk to you about.
I could talk.
What's that?
Forever. I could talk about this forever. I would love to.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. And I'm reading You Were Not So Dumb, and I've got to get You Were Not So Smart. Although I feel like I got that book from the pod. That's why I went to You Were Now Less Dumb. So thank you very much for joining us. Is there anything you want to promote or anything before I let you go?
I haven't told anyone this, so I'll tell your listeners that I'm working on a offshoot of You're Not So Smart, a new podcast. It's going to be about. I'm not going to tell you what it's about yet, but we're working on a spinoff, and that'll be you'll get more information about that in the next 6 months.
Does it have to do with the workings of the mind?
It is actually going to be more about science literacy.
Oh, fantastic! That's just we were complaining about for the last hour. So,
right. I was dying. A bead of sweat was going down my temple. I was like, "Oh, do I tell them?"
and by the same token, if there's anything we can do to support you, let me know, and hopefully we'll send a bunch of our listeners over there because they will. You will pay. It will pay dividends for you all to go over there and spend a little time fishing around some of David's stuff. So, David, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You got it. We'll talk soon. David McRaney.
Find us here on Facebook, Twitter, at Dr. Drew, at Weekly Infusion, at First Lady of Love. Go to drdrew.com and send us your questions, your ideas, and we will get to these emails. The First Lady of Love looks at everything, and we will get to them on the upcoming shows. We are doing some live and weekly emails about health topics. Also, look around and check out the podcast I do with Adam, Bob Forrest, a new show with Ami Horowitz called The Howard Vortex. Oh, yes. Where we look into the minds of the whack packers every week and the lives of the people around them. So please do check out what we got there at drdrew.com. We appreciate your support, and I think you'll like them.
Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.
Remember, you can find all these podcasts at drdrew.com. The Dr. Drew podcast, the This Live podcast with Dr. Drew and Bob Forrest, and the Adam and Drew podcast, which is available 5 days a week. Find them all on iTunes and rate us 5 stars. Subscribe and get it first. And if you're really happy, click on the Amazon banner at drdrew.com to help support the show. We'll thank you for it. If you join the email list via drdrew.com/contact, we'll send you a weekly infusion newsletter with Dr. Drew's news. We're so grateful when you get in touch. We read all your emails and we'll bring you the subject matter you want to hear about.